The rain fell heavy against the cracked windows of the abandoned checkpoint, thunder rolling across the dark mountains as if the storm itself knew what was about to unfold, and she stood there, unarmed, her rifle taken away by the men who thought stripping her weapon meant stripping her strength, their mistake already written in the tension that hung like smoke in the air. Her body coiled with a calm that came only from years of training and battles survived, and as the first man smirked and stepped closer with the arrogance of someone who underestimated her, her eyes never blinked, her breathing never changed, she simply moved, a blur of precision, snapping his wrist before his blade could even flash, the knife clattering to the floor just as her elbow drove into his throat, collapsing his airways and sending him choking backward, silence lasting less than a second before the others realized she was no victim, no helpless prisoner, but a storm they could not contain, and the second man lunged with rage instead of skill, swinging wide with brute force, his fist meeting only air as she sidestepped, catching his arm and using his own weight to send him crashing headfirst into the concrete pillar, blood blooming instantly across his brow, his body dropping limp while she pivoted without pause, her bare feet gripping the wet ground as the third rushed in from behind, thinking speed would give him an advantage, but she had lived too long in shadows and combat zones to be caught from her blind side, her heel striking backward into his knee with surgical precision, bone cracking audibly, his scream rising but cut short as she twisted and drove her palm into his jaw, the impact shattering teeth and sending his body spinning sideways into the rusted railing, and by now the final two had lost the smirk of superiority, their eyes flickering with something closer to fear though pride kept them charging, one wielding a chain ripped from the wall while the other clenched a steel rod, their weapons gleaming under the lightning that split the sky. But she did not retreat, she advanced, closing the gap faster than they could swing, stepping inside the arc of the chain, catching it on her forearm with a wince but no hesitation, her free hand slamming into his ribs until he gasped and faltered, the chain falling loose as her leg rose in a ruthless arc, the ball of her foot crashing against his temple and sending him spinning to the ground unconscious, and before the last man could even lift the rod above his head she had already snatched it from his grip, flipping it in her hands, the cold steel an extension of her will as she drove it into his midsection, air exploding from his lungs, then sweeping it across his legs to drop him hard to the floor where she finished with a crushing strike to his throat that left him twitching in silence, and all of it had taken no more than 83 seconds, less time than it takes most to load a rifle, yet. In those seconds 5 men who had mocked her, restrained her, stripped her of steel and powder and fire, now lay broken across the floor of the checkpoint, their pride shattered as thoroughly as their bones, and she stood above them, chest rising steady, rain dripping from her hair into eyes that burned not with triumph but with the focus of someone who knew this was only the beginning, because she could already hear more footsteps approaching, more voices echoing through the storm, reinforcements coming for their fallen comrades, and though her hands were raw, though blood from her own arm mingled with the rain, she tightened her grip on the rod, every nerve in her body alive, every memory of war and survival pulsing through her veins, ready to prove once again that no rifle, no weapon, no chain of steel could ever match the fury of her hands and the will that drove them. The storm howled louder as the sound of boots striking the wet concrete echoed closer, a dozen shadows stretching across the broken walls as reinforcements poured into the checkpoint, their rifles raised, their shouts cutting through the rain, but she did not flinch, she crouched low like a predator ready to strike, the steel rod spinning in her hands as if it were forged for her alone, and the first bullet cracked through the air, a muzzle flash lighting the dark like a lightning bolt, yet she was already moving, diving behind a fallen pillar as shards of concrete sprayed into her hair, her mind calculating every sound, every movement, her muscles recalling training burned into her bones, and as one soldier advanced too close, confident that the cover pinned her down, she burst from the shadows, rod lashing upward into his jaw with a sickening snap, the rifle clattering from his hands, and before his partner could react she seized the weapon, rolled across the ground and squeezed the trigger, controlled bursts punching through the storm, dropping 2 more men before they had time to aim, their bodies collapsing into the mud as chaos spread through the squad, their formation broken, their courage leaking as fast as the rain dripping from their helmets, and though she now held a rifle again she refused to stay still, weaving between cover, never where they expected, her shots clean, efficient, every squeeze of the trigger a decision not of rage but of survival, and within seconds 4 more had fallen, cries drowned by the thunder as fear settled deep into the remaining soldiers, yet they pressed on, firing wildly, grenades clinking against the ground, explosions tearing open the checkpoint walls and showers of dust and flame, but she used the smoke as her veil, slipping through it unseen, sliding across the wet floor to sweep one man's legs out from under him, jamming the rifle stock into his chest before pivoting, firing point blank into the next who rushed blindly through the haze, and by the time the smoke cleared half the squad lay broken, half there. Weapons scattered, and she stood tall in the center, bruised and bloodied but unshaken, her eyes like fire cutting through the storm, and one soldier dropped his rifle, whispering a curse under his breath as he stumbled back, but another, driven by desperation, raised a shotgun and roared, the blast tearing past her shoulder close enough to burn the skin, yet she closed the distance before he could pump again, her elbow crashing into his jaw, the rifle spinning free as she caught it mid-air. Flipping it with the smoothness of instinct, and used it not to fire but to smash its steel but into his temple, the crack echoing louder than the thunder as he fell silent, and now only three stood, circling her like wolves that knew the bear was stronger, sweat mixing with rain on their faces, their breaths ragged, and she turned slowly, never lowering her weapon, but then she threw it aside with deliberate defiance, letting it clatter across the wet floor, her hands raised not in surrender, but in challenge because she wanted them close, wanted them to believe they had a chance in their fists, and pride overrode their caution as the three charged, one swinging wild, another going low, the third waiting to strike when she was distracted, but she moved like a storm embodied, her knee rising into the first man's stomach, folding him in half before her fist hammered into his skull, spinning to catch the second with a sharp kick to the ribs that cracked like splintering wood, and when the third tried to lock his arms around her throat, she snapped her head back, crushing his nose with the back of her skull, breaking free and driving her elbow into his ribs until he wheezed blood into the rain, and then silence fell again, silence broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the ragged breath escaping her chest, and she looked around at the devastation, the floor littered with broken weapons, broken men, the checkpoint a graveyard of arrogance, and she felt the burn in her muscles, the sting of cuts across her arms, but also the fire still alive inside her, a fire that told her this was not the end, because far below in the valley she could see headlights cutting through the rain, trucks approaching fast, heavier reinforcements, more guns, more men, and yet as the storm whipped her hair across her face she did not retreat, she tightened her fists, raised her chin, and whispered to herself the only truth that mattered, that they could take her rifle, they could take her weapons, they could take the walls around her, but they could never take the war from her hands, and tonight, as long as she could still draw breath, every second, every strike, every heartbeat would belong to her alone. The valley trembled with the growl of approaching engines, headlights slicing through the sheets of rain like hungry eyes searching for prey, and she stood at the shattered checkpoint, body bruised and blood dripping from her knuckles, yet her stance unbroken, her spirit sharpened by the knowledge that another wave was coming, stronger, louder, more ruthless than the last, and as the first truck skidded to a stop on the mud-soaked road she could already count at least 20 men leaping from its bed, armored, armed, rifles raised in perfect formation, their discipline marking them as professionals rather than the overconfident thugs she had already broken. But even professionals bled, even professionals fell, and she knew that fear could shatter their order just as surely as her fists shattered bone. So instead of hiding she advanced, walking straight into the stormlight like a ghost refusing to be forgotten, her silhouette framed against the lightning, daring them to fire, and for a heartbeat they hesitated, unsettled by the sight of a woman standing alone amidst the ruins of their dead, unarmed but unwavering, but then one barked an order and the air exploded with gunfire, rounds tearing into the concrete around her, sparks dancing across the steel, and she dropped low, sprinting between the flashes, her legs carrying her faster than their aim could adjust, rolling beneath the cover of the truck itself, the stench of diesel and gunpowder thick in her lungs, and before they realized she was among them she had already torn the sidearm from the hip of one soldier, pressing it into his ribs and firing twice, his body collapsing against the wheels as she spun, firing in tight controlled bursts that cut down three more before their comrades turned their rifles inward. But it was chaos now, their own formation disrupted, their bullets ricocheting off metal, and she used that chaos like a blade, sliding under the chassis to the far side, emerging behind two soldiers who never saw her coming until the pistol cracked against the back of their skulls, dropping them both into the mud, and with every shot, every strike, she moved like water, never still, never predictable, until the pistol clicked empty, its chamber dry, and she hurled it into the face of another before wrenching the knife from his vest, the blade glinting as she slashed across his thigh, sending him screaming to his knees, and then another truck screeched into view, more boots pounding the earth, more voices shouting commands, and she knew she could not win this by attrition, not against numbers this endless, but she could win by fire, by fear, by turning their strength against them. So she dashed to the fallen soldier at her feet, ripped a grenade from his belt, and pulled the pin with her teeth, hurling it beneath the truck before sprinting back into the shadows, the explosion ripping the night apart in a fireball that engulfed half the squad, the blast wave slamming against her chest like a hammer as bodies were hurled through the air, smoke swallowing the cries of the wounded, and in that haze she struck again, no pause, no hesitation, grabbing a fallen rifle and cutting through the staggered survivors with ruthless precision, every bullet a sentence, every motion a promise, until silence fell once more except for the roar of flames consuming twisted steel, and she stood there breathing hard, hair plastered to her face, smoke clinging to her lungs but still alive, still unyielding, though her body screamed in pain, her shoulders burning, her arms trembling from the relentless violence, and yet she refused to stop, refused to collapse, because beyond the flames she could see yet another truck grinding to a halt, men shouting, commanders pointing, heavier weapons being pulled into the rain, and she wiped the blood from her lips with the back of her hand, her chest rising steady again, her eyes narrowing with the calm of someone who had already accepted what she was, not just a fighter, not just a survivor, but the storm itself, and she whispered under her breath that if they wanted to bury her here, they would need more than rifles and steel, they would need an army, and even then she would not fall quietly, because she had already decided that every second of her life would cost them a man, and every breath they took would come at the price of blood, and with that vow burning inside her she stepped through the smoke, ready for the next wave, ready to turn their endless reinforcements into endless graves. The flames from the shattered truck licked the night sky, casting wild shadows across the rain-soaked valley as the rumble of heavier engines announced that the enemy had grown serious, and from the darkness rolled armored carriers bristling with mounted guns, their turrets swiveling like watchful eyes, while squads of soldiers poured out with the precision of men drilled not just for combat but for extermination, their boots slamming into the mud in perfect rhythm, rifles raised, grenades clipped to their belts, and for the first time since the storm began she felt the weight of numbers pressing down like the walls of a collapsing world, yet instead of breaking her resolve it sharpened it, because if they thought machines and formations would crush her, they had forgotten that steel and fire meant nothing against the will of someone who refused to kneel, and she sprinted toward the ruins of the checkpoint, dodging the first hail of heavy rounds that shredded concrete pillars into dust, sparks raining as bullets tore through metal beams, her lungs burning as she dove behind a collapsed wall, debris raining on her back, but she did not wait, did not cower, instead she tore the strap of a fallen rifle from a corpse and rolled into position, returning fire with icy precision, her rounds cracking through the storm to drop 3 soldiers before they had time to adjust their sights, yet more poured forward, more boots thundering, more voices shouting orders, and then a mounted gun spat fire, tearing a line of destruction across the wall she hid behind, chunks of stone erupting as she dove again, sliding across the slick ground to another piece of cover, the roar of the turret chasing her every step, and she knew she needed to get closer, needed to bring the battle into her hands where machines meant less and fear meant more, so she dragged herself through mud and blood, crawling low until she was near enough to smell the oil of the carrier, and when 2 soldiers swept past searching the shadows she erupted upward, smashing the butt of her rifle into one skull while seizing the other by his vest, wrenching his own knife from his belt and plunging it deep beneath his ribs before shoving his body into the mud to silence his scream, and without pausing she stripped his grenades, pulling 2 pins at once and hurling them beneath the armored carrier, the explosion flipping the machine onto its side in a thunderous crash, fire spewing from its hatches. The men inside screamed in trapped panic, and chaos rippled again through their ranks, formation broken by shock and flame, and she rose with blood and rain dripping down her face, charging through the smoke like a phantom with death clutched in her hands, firing in short bursts, dropping 2, 3, 4 more as she weaved between their collapsing lines, until her rifle clicked empty. And she tossed it aside without hesitation, seizing a steel pipe from the rubble and swinging it with the force of desperation turned to fury, caving in the helmet of one soldier before spinning to shatter the arm of another, his rifle tumbling free into her grip just in time to gun down the man who tried to flank her. And by then the storm was deafening, gunfire, explosions, thunder merging into a single roar, but in her mind there was silence, only the rhythm of survival, strike, move, strike. Again and slowly, impossibly, the larger force began to falter, their commanders screaming into radios, their men hesitating as the sight of their burning machines and the pile of their dead stripped away the confidence drilled into them. And yet even as they faltered she could feel exhaustion tearing at her own body, her arms heavy, her legs trembling, every movement demanding more than she had left to give, but she forced herself forward, forced herself to stand because weakness meant death. And death meant silence, and silence was something she had never accepted. So when the last wave of this group tried to retreat to regroup she pursued, cutting them down one by one until the field was littered with their broken forms, the valley echoing not with their commands but with their dying gasps, and when at last the final rifle fell silent and the last flame guttered low, she dropped to one knee, chest heaving, her hands raw and blistered, blood soaking through her clothes, but her eyes still fixed on the horizon where even more headlights shimmered in the rain, and she knew the night was far from over, that this was only the middle of the storm, and though her body begged for rest, her spirit refused, because she had already sworn that as long as she stood, no army, no machine, no endless wave of enemies would ever erase her, and if they wanted victory they would have to take it from her lifeless hands. The rain had turned the valley into a river of mud and smoke, flames still clawing at the sky from the wreckage of the overturned carrier, bodies scattered like broken shadows across the ground, and yet as she rose again on trembling legs, forcing her aching muscles to obey, the horizon lit up with new beams of white, floodlights cutting through the storm as the heavy thump of rotor blades grew louder, helicopters swooping in like vultures circling carrion, their searchlights sweeping across the shattered checkpoint, and she felt the air shake with the weight of their arrival, dust and rain swirling as the machines descended, doors sliding open to unleash fresh squads of armored men who rappelled down on ropes, landing in perfect coordination, rifles already aimed, voices barking commands in unison, and the ground force that remained cheered with renewed courage, thinking the tide had turned, but she did not wait for them to organize, she did not give them the chance to surround her. Instead she sprinted into the glare of their lights, her silhouette a blur. The sudden audacity of her charge disrupting their timing as bullets chased her through the mud, one grazing her shoulder, another sparking against the steel beam she used for cover, yet she pressed forward, sliding beneath the hail of fire until she was close enough to seize the leg of a soldier still dangling from a rope, yanking him down with such force that his skull cracked against the concrete, the rifle tearing from his grip into her hands, and she rolled into cover, opening fire with ruthless precision, the recoil slamming into her bruised arms as she cut down three more before they could land properly, their bodies tumbling into the mud while their comrades shouted in panic, and above, one helicopter banked lower, its door gun spitting fury shredding the ground into fountains of earth and water, but she dove into a trench left by the last explosion, the rounds screaming overhead, her mind racing, knowing that if she did not bring down the machines the battle would never end, so when the gunfire paused for a breath she bolted forward, weaving through the floodlights until she reached the burning wreck of the carrier, heat blistering her skin as she ripped open the corpse of a soldier, hands tearing at his belt until she found what she needed, a rocket launcher still strapped to his back, heavy and slick with blood, and though her arms trembled from exhaustion she lifted it onto her shoulder, teeth clenched, eyes narrowed against the rain, and as the helicopter swung back into range she fired, the rocket screaming through the night before slamming into the side of the machine, the explosion lighting the valley like a second sun, the chopper spinning in fire before crashing into the hillside in a storm of steel and sparks, men shouting in horror as debris rained down, but she had no time to celebrate, no time to breathe, because the second helicopter was already circling, its gunner locking onto her position, and she sprinted through the smoke of the first crash, bullets chewing the ground at her heels, until she slid into the gutted checkpoint bunker, chest heaving, mind burning with the question of how to survive the next assault. But even as fear clawed at her chest she forced it down, forced herself to listen, to feel the rhythm of the storm, and she heard the whine of ropes dropping again, more men descending into the mud, their boots splashing as they shouted orders, and she knew she had to strike before they organized, so she gripped the blood-slick launcher again, dragging her battered body back into the open, waiting for the spotlight to catch her, and when it did she held steady, ignoring the rain blinding her eyes, ignoring the ache tearing through her muscles, and she fired once more, the rocket streaking upward into the belly of the second helicopter, the explosion shredding its hull into fire, its wreck spiraling down to smash into the valley floor, the shockwave knocking her onto her back, mud filling her mouth as she gasped for air, ears ringing, vision swimming, but when she forced herself to rise again, two helicopters lay burning in the storm, their twisted remains proof that even machines of war could fall before her hands, and though her arms now hung heavy, though blood soaked her side where a bullet had grazed deeper than she cared to admit, she stood defiant as the remaining soldiers hesitated, their rifles shaking, their courage collapsing, and she let them see her. Like that, broken yet unbowed, drenched in rain and blood yet still moving forward, because she knew that in their hearts they were already defeated, that no matter how many men or machines they threw into the valley, none would leave unscarred so long as she still drew breath, and with that truth burning inside her she raised her fists again, daring them to come, daring them to try, her voice cutting through the thunder as she growled that she was not done, not tonight, not ever, and the storm itself seemed to answer, lightning splitting the sky as if the heavens too knew her war was far from over. Part 6 Bana du Laki Koi Gap Na Hu, or 800 words Pora Hu. The silence that followed the destruction of the tanks was heavy, broken only by the hiss of rain on fire and the faint groans of the dying, and she stood in the middle of it all, swaying but unyielding, her chest heaving as smoke poured from the wrecks around her, and though her body was battered to the edge of collapse, her will remained carved in stone. Yet deep in the storm she heard the shift of engines far more distant, a sound like thunder but sharper, mechanical, calculated, and when she lifted her eyes to the sky she saw them, drones swarming in formation like metal vultures, red eyes glowing as they swept into the valley, each armed with rockets and guns designed not for intimidation but for annihilation, and behind them came the scream of jets ripping across the clouds, their silhouettes black against the lightning as they circled above, and on the ground new trucks arrived, sleeker, reinforced, the kind that carried not just soldiers but something more dangerous, and out of them stepped men dressed differently than the rest, their armor heavier, their movements colder, every motion calculated, and she recognized them instantly, the elite, the kind sent only when the warlords wanted absolute certainty, the kind who never retreated, who never disobeyed, who never left survivors, and still she did not step back, she did not cower, she rolled her shoulders though they ached with fire and spat the blood from her mouth into the mud, raising her fists once again to remind them she was still alive, and when the first drone unleashed its hail of rounds she dove into the wreckage of the nearest tank, shards of steel tearing her arms as she slid beneath the carcass, bullets hammering against the hull like drums, sparks flying around her, but her mind was already searching for an opening, already seeking a way to turn their machines against them, and when one drone hovered too close, sweeping its red light across the wreckage, she leapt from cover with a roar, catching its frame mid-hover, dragging it down into the mud and slamming a broken steel bar into its core until it sparked and screamed, its explosion throwing her back but also ripping apart 3 soldiers who had advanced too close, and she rolled onto her feet again, battered but grinning with a feral fire, snatching their fallen weapons before weaving into the fray, firing upward at the drones, her aim wild but unrelenting, clipping one from the sky, then another, until smoke trailed from their burning husks as they crashed into the mud, yet still more swarmed, their wings buzzing like hornets, and she sprinted into the open, zigzagging across the mud as rockets rained down, explosions chasing her every step, and at the last moment she dove through the shattered wall of the checkpoint, her body slamming into the ground but her mind already racing, already hearing the heavy footsteps of the elite squad advancing, their rifles trained, their visors glowing faintly in the storm, and she knew she could not fight them like the others, she could not rely only on speed or fury, she would need to be sharper, colder, more ruthless, so she pressed herself against the shadowed wall, waiting, listening to their rhythm, their boots striking the ground in perfect synchronization, and when the first passed she struck. Like a knife in the dark, her arms snaking around his throat, twisting with such force that his neck snapped before he could cry out, and she stripped his weapon, a sleek silenced rifle, spinning it into her grip and using it to drop the next 2 with surgical precision, their helmets shattering as bullets cut through visors, and the others responded instantly, no panic in them, only mechanical efficiency as they fanned out, covering each angle, but she was already moving, sliding into the shadows, using the rain and smoke to vanish, striking from where they least expected, her movements fueled by instinct and desperation, and soon their formation began to splinter, their perfect rhythm disrupted, their calm cracking as they realized she was not prey but predator, and she carved through them with a ferocity that even they, trained for death, could not contain, until the ground was littered with their armored forms, sparks hissing from their broken gear, and above her the jets screamed lower, preparing their payloads, the final measure, the strike meant to erase everything in the valley, and she stumbled to the center of the battlefield, her chest heaving, blood streaming down her side, yet her eyes locked onto the sky, daring them to unleash hell, because if they did she would rise from it, she would endure it, and though her body trembled and her fists shook, her voice rose against the thunder, a roar that carried through the storm to every enemy ear, a declaration that she was still alive, and as lightning split the clouds her figure stood framed in fire and shadow, unbroken, untamed, waiting for the sky itself to fall so she could rise through its ashes. The sky split open as the jets roared overhead, their engines screaming like banshees as their payloads armed, red lights flashing in the storm, and the ground troops who remained began to scatter, their commanders shouting for retreat, because even they knew the fire that was about to fall would consume friend and foe alike. But she stood rooted in the center of the battlefield, her body torn and bruised, her blood dripping into the mud that had already swallowed so many, her breaths ragged but steady, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles cracked, and in her eyes there was no fear, only defiance, a fire that no machine, no army, no storm could extinguish, and as the first jet descended lower she sprinted toward the burning wreck of a helicopter, climbing its twisted skeleton despite the flames searing her skin, dragging herself higher until she stood at its peak, framed against the storm, her hair whipping in the wind, her silhouette carved in fire and lightning. And she roared into the sky as the bombs detached, their sleek bodies whistling death as they fell, the valley exploding in waves of flame that shook the mountains themselves, the shock waves ripping trees from their roots and hurling steel like feathers. But through the inferno she leapt, diving from the wreckage into the collapsing trench as fire swallowed the world, the earth shattering above her as if the heavens had split apart, and for long moments there was nothing but smoke and silence. Nothing but ruin and ash, and the soldiers watching from the ridges whispered that nothing could have survived, no flesh could endure what had just been unleashed, and yet as the smoke thinned, as the rain began to cut through the fire, a shape moved, slow at first, then steady, a figure dragging itself from the crater with blood streaming down every limb, clothes scorched, skin raw, but alive in a way that defied reason, and when the survivors saw her they did not raise their rifles. They did not shout, they simply stared in silence, because in that moment she was no longer just a soldier, no longer just a woman stripped of her rifle, she was something beyond, something carved from fury and will, a storm-given flesh, and she stood at the crater's edge, swaying but unyielding, raising her fists once more as if daring the sky to strike again, daring the world to try and bury her, and the rain fell harder, washing the blood and ash from her face until only her eyes remained. Sharp, burning brighter than the fires around her, and in those eyes they saw the truth, that they could kill her body 1,000 times and she would rise 1,000 more, that no army, no machine, no storm of fire could silence what she had become, and so the soldiers who remained lowered their weapons, their commanders frozen in disbelief, and one by one they turned, retreating into the night, leaving the valley to her, leaving the legend of the woman who had dropped 5 men with her bare hands and then fought an army alone, and as the storm finally began to break, as dawn's first light touched the horizon, she sank to her knees at last, her strength spent, her body collapsing into the mud that had drunk so much blood, but there was a faint smile on her lips, because she had done more than survive, she had carved her defiance into the bones of the earth, and even if her eyes closed forever in that moment, her story would never die, it would travel in whispers and roars in fear and awe, that once in a storm-soaked valley a woman stripped of her rifle had fought until the sky itself broke, and she had not been defeated, because defeat was something she had never learned. The end.